All right. Good morning. So we are joined here today at JCRC by Dr. Eitan Hersh, Professor of Political Science at Tufts University. Dr. Hersh received his PhD from Harvard University and has a wide range of interests that have fascinated us at the Jewish Community Relations Council and certainly are of interest to those in the Boston Jewish community who are thinking about our civic engagement, this moment, whether this moment you think of as after October 7th or this moment in these days of January 2025 as we enter a new political arena in Washington, D.C. His focus is on U.S. elections and civic participation, and I'm looking forward to having a wide-ranging conversation about the work he's doing and the things he's interested in these days. So welcome, Dr. Hersh, and if I can call you Eitan for the rest of our conversation, it will be easier.
You can definitely call me Eitan, and it's a pleasure to be here with you.
All right. Well, welcome. So why don't we start with some of the work you're doing about civic engagement? And we were talking a few minutes ago about this recent paper you did on public perceptions of local influence. And if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so some of my research on civic engagement has been moving toward a question about the civic role of business leaders and what business people should do in politics. And that led me to this fun little project I did with a former student, Josh Hochberg, who's now a law student. And we were looking at research from like 70 years ago, where if you asked people in America, ordinary citizens, who is the most important person in your community? The first thing we learned is that most people had an answer. Like the majority of people could list a person. They were in Columbus, Ohio, and John Smith, the auto dealer, is the most important person in my community, or something like that. And so we wanted to ask this question today and see what answers we got. And so we asked it a number of times over the last couple of years in different, with different language around how we asked the question. And there are two basic findings, right? First of all, most people cannot answer the question. That is, they cannot think of a single person, even when prompted in different ways, like who do you think has most influence? Who's most important for your opinion formation? Most people just have no idea how to answer with an individual name. And the second thing, that those who do answer with an individual almost never say a business person, right? They'll say a state political actor, a politician, someone like that. Oftentimes the person they say is almost clearly not the most important person in their community. Mm-hmm. They'll say, for example, a statewide or national influencer. Yeah, and that would not be like sort of a person who can move things at a community level in policymaking. So those are the two things: the decay of business as the prime movers and shakers of local and state politics, and then just an inability for anyone to know anything about who's moving and shaking anything.
It's very much about the locals. So you're not asking them like, who's more important, the president or the pope? You're asking them who
in your local community,
issues in your town,
in your local community.
Okay. We
let them purposely define local community because it could mean slightly different things in different parts of the country. Some people live in rural counties. Some people live in, the Upper West Side of New York. It could mean different things, but it was about the local community.
And so, what do you take from that?
Right. So clearly, there's been a just decay of local knowledge among ordinary citizens, a big focus on national politics only. We don't need to go through the details about, the decay of local media, but clearly most people just don't know what's going on in their local community. There's a lot of research on whether that's sort of like a supply side, or the demand side. Do people not want local news, or does local news provision, which did rely on things like advertisements and things like that, is there no supply? I think it's mostly a demand issue.
Okay.
So the public does not demand local news, except for in fairly elite circles.
Okay.
So there's the demand side. And so there's a big nationalization. That's the big story of American politics. Everything is nationalized. So when you and I think of a Democrat and Republican, this contributes to polarization because we might think in our heads of like Ted Cruz and AOC.
Right.
We don't think of necessarily the first people that come to our head is not like Charlie Baker and Maura Healey, whose politics are that far apart from one another.
It's interesting to use those examples. I was just talking to the group last night about how most people in Greater Boston could not name their own mayor or the head of like their town council or their town supervisor, whereas they could certainly name the mayor of the city of Boston in most cases, even though that's not actually who serves them and meets the needs of their community. I know I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is the fourth largest city in Massachusetts. And I don't think there's been coverage in any of the non-hyper-local media of a Cambridge municipal election in the entire time I've lived there, which is now almost 15 years. Like you never see it in the Boston Globe or the Herald or any of the local TV media. So I think most people in Cambridge have no idea who our mayor is.
I mean, and the other thing that's going on with business is that business truly has changed so dramatically over a couple generations due to financialization, due to companies buying up other companies and people working for these huge multinational companies, that the days of a local retailer or banker having a lot of influence in the local community is somewhat behind us. Not entirely, but it's definitely not what it was 50 or 60 years ago, which is interesting to think about it in terms of is that good or bad, and you can make cases for both.
It's interesting you bring that up because I've spent a bit of time thinking about the ways in which Jewish business sector leaders have shaped and built the Jewish institutional systems that we have today. But this is going back to like the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and how much of an era is behind us now where Jewish business, small business people, local business owners, groceries, supermarkets, apparel stores, for example, or real estate, a lot of folks in real estate who had business interests at City Hall, zoning, tax policy, whatever, and were therefore engaged civically out of their self-interest of their business, but were also willing to use those relationships and felt an obligation to the community to use those relationships in service to Jewish concerns. So you might have the owner of the local supermarket or the owner of a local range of housing development who 90% of their relationship with the mayor of Boston is straight up business interests, but they're engaged because of their business interests. But they're also willing to call the mayor when they are concerned about, say, police department responding to anti-Semitism.
Right.
And to a large extent, I look around today and I see a lot of the Jewish volunteer leaders don't have their own interests at City Hall professionally. Like they're not engaged in civic life because of the business interests that they have. And therefore, they're not holding those relationships in turn with the ability to say, Governor, I've been your friend and ally for many years. We worked a lot together in advancement of, say, zoning policy. I'm concerned about how the state is responding on this issue of Jewish concern. And I think it's a real change in the Jewish volunteer leadership over the last several decades.
Yeah, right. So it's interesting to think about whether that is due to the changing dynamics of industry or whether it's changing civic culture, because you can make both cases, right? So just like the retailers of the past, the probably people in real estate, people in banking today, those are industries where they do well when the community writ large does well. And so they have a stake in, for the bank's case, like depositors going to them, and when the whole community thrives, they actually make more money. And it's always been those industries that have had a sort of like a long-term economic / civic engagement in local communities. We say, investments like whether it's in the arts or economic development or transit or education matter both to our businesses and to us individually. They matter to us businesses because, a growing middle class, that's good for our business. We want rising housing prices, that's good for our business, whatever it is. The retailers are kind of gone as a major force. Mm-hmm. But there are just general people who are like employers, and they can think, if they choose to, think about the long-term health of their community as, well, we definitely need a good education system so that we can hire good employees. We definitely want a safe community with good policing for the sake of our business and employees. But the cultural change is that a lot of people just separate their economic interests from their civic ones, and they have not developed those kinds of relationships that you're talking about with the mayor, the governor, city councilors. They're not in the thick of things. Mm-hmm. They don't know how policymaking works. They literally don't know how a bill becomes a law. And that's a real challenge when you have an issue like maybe in the Jewish community. It was like, well, okay, we need people who have these relationships to now say something in defense of interests of the Jewish people. And you have a huge number of people who might think of themselves as wanting to be engaged, but they don't know how to do it and they don't have the relationships.
So let's come back to the specifics of your study and what does that tell us going forward? I mean, if about people not having accurate perceptions of who has influence and therefore how do people engage civically and how do we understand who has actual influence if those perceptions are so off?
First of all, it's not a shock that we have something like 15% turnout rates in local elections when only about 15-20% of people can even name someone who is an opinion leader, someone they trust, or someone who is influential. Like people are just checked out. And so, if you think it's not good to have a democratic system with 15% participation, like that's kind of a problem. You might think it's fine. Those who care and are most interested get the most power in the system, and maybe that's fine. You could tell that story.
You could.
I'll tell you who tells that story is teachers unions tell that story. One very interesting finding about local elections is that when elections are least well attended, usually in off cycles, meaning, when there's election in odd number of years or in March on Thursdays, teachers unions and their interests thrive because they turn out no matter what. So they're in organized interests and they will always vote in those elections. And when there's only 10 or 15% turnout, those interests dominate. So like they would be winners in a low turnout local election system. I think the broader case when I present about my most recent book, Politics is for Power, to audiences, and people ask, like, if you wanted to be more engaged in politics, how would you do it? And I give them the texting quiz, which is, who do you have a texting relationship with that's a public official? And I would say that any person should and can have a texting relationship with their state rep. That
might be a lot to ask of a state rep if they have 100,000 constituents.
But they won't have 100,000 who are interested in this.
Okay.
Yeah, but the people who are reading my, I would love for 100,000 people to read my book and then take this advice. Okay, but it's not 100,000 people. The people who think of themselves as in the know, who care, who are spending an hour or two every day thinking about news, worrying about politics, they really should have a texting relationship if they want power and for their issues, for what they care about. And if they don't, if they're just playing a game, most people in politics who are regular citizens are just kind of playing a game. They're watching juicy, gossipy news, and that's their relationship with politics. Just like that's like my kids' relationship to sports. They follow the stats and they are interested in who's hired and fired, and that's their relationship. Okay, if that's your relationship with politics, you're doing everything right. Just go on Twitter, enjoy. But if you want some kind of long-term engagement and power for the issues you care about, you should know your state reps. You should know people who are in the city council. You should have, and it doesn't mean you're going to get what you want. I just had I don't know if you saw this. I have an article this week in Commonwealth magazine. It's actually a Jewish issue. The local community in Newton, where I live, voted to defund buses to private schools. And there's really only two schools affected. The school where my kids go, Schechter, and Mount Alverny Academy, a Catholic school. And, I went to the school board meeting and I talked to the school board chair, and I think I understand their position, and I think it's really wrong. And so I'm glad I was able to pick up the phone and talk to this person in a respectful way. I'm glad I understand their interests. And now I get to work with people who are aligned with me and mobilize folks, maybe consider a lawsuit. It's not clear what Newton's doing is legal, and try to get my interests expressed well, and maybe we'll win. If the typical person, unless they're affected by this, like they lose their school bus, will never know. They won't know what side they're on. They haven't thought about the issue, and if they have, they won't know what to do about it. And I think you don't have to be a political science professor to have that kind of relationship to politics.
So who does have actual influence, and how does one deepen community understanding of who has actual influence and power to move an agenda?
I think if you're a business person, it's actually quite straightforward. You want to have a long-term relationship to
people who can influence the success of your business.
Right. And you don't know what's coming down the road, right? You don't know the issue that you're going to care about 2 years from now. So you want to maintain relationships and get to know people. And so when you approach them, you know how to approach them. You know something about what they care about. You know where they're coming from. And so you, the strategic business leader, but this could be just any citizen, knows how to approach different politicians and what's in it for them and how they think about the world. And it won't be like a weird, awkward first conversation when you ask them for something.
So you're really talking about people who hold relationships, not necessarily who are trying to advance a single agenda. We're talking about not necessarily, say, the nonprofit who's solely focused on one issue being the civic driver, but you're actually talking about people who hold relationships and can be in the room when a decision on something that matters to them is being discussed.
Correct. And I think regular citizens, just like organizations, probably like JCRC, have both core interests and peripheral interests. And being at the table for peripheral interests gives you the opportunity to be at the table for core interests. Tell you, like, I'm trying to think of a personal example here. I usually don't share too much about personal politics,
Sure.
but this is not even a state person. Why do I have Jake Auchincloss's phone number? I don't know. I think because he helped me with something at work once at Tufts. He was a guest speaker or something like this. And
Sure.
I've always valued what he's had to say in public. And, after the war in Israel started, I think Congressman Auchincloss, from my perspective, was like an exemplary leader. And I remember just texting him, I can't remember, a couple months after the war started, just saying, I really, at a personal level, I just really appreciate what you're doing. And does that matter to his policy? It's just a drop in the bucket. I'm just like a random dude in his district. But I think it's really important that members of Congress feel like people are behind them when they go out on a limb and they advocate for something that people care about. So the point is that he's not on my cell phone because I have an interest in because of Israel. That's not really like an area that I do research on very much. And of course, it's not happened after a war started, but when something happened that I really cared about, I was able to communicate that to him, and just in this case, just to thank him. And that was meaningful to me. And I think that's like meaningful in terms of political relationships.
Well, I'm not sure you're quite the random dude considering the public platform you get in like the Commonwealth magazine or the Boston Globe or others that are covering the classes you're teaching. There aren't that many professors of political science who teach an innovative class on understanding an ideology that gets national coverage. So like, I'm not sure I would quite downplay the random dude in his district. And it's also true that public officials keep track of pretty much every feedback data point, positive or negative, on their positions. And they know often exactly how many thousands of letters they've gotten on one side or the other of an issue,
right,
going beyond whether they actually hold and value the opinions of certain individuals more than others.
Right.
You've been talking about business leaders. So let's talk maybe not the study itself, but what that says about Jewish community leadership here. And obviously, we are an organization that expressly engages in civic space and holds long-term relationships with lots of public leaders and public officials. Probably you walk into the average, the random member of a synagogue in Newton or Brookline and say, do you know what JCRC is, or do you know who Jeremy Burton is? They never heard of me, or they've never even heard of our organization necessarily. So what does that say? What should we be thinking about as an organization? And what should the community be thinking about as a community in terms of how we move a community agenda on, say, Beacon Hill or at City Hall?
On the one hand, JCRC might be very important to organized Jewish communities, and doesn't need to be something that every ordinary Boston Jew or Massachusetts Jew knows about in detail. In part because it's not totally realistic that every, member of a synagogue is going to, follow your legislative agenda or something like that. But at some level, you want the elites of, and I don't say in academia, we use words like elites all the time. We need something different than, but like the folks who are most involved in any synagogue, say, they should know what's going on at JCRC. And I think the relationship, right, is back and forth. That is, there are some times where you're going to learn what the agenda should be from what people are telling you, and you really need to listen to it, right? And sometimes you have to tell them what the issues are.
I can assure you that people are telling me every single day what the agenda ought to be, and probably while I was sitting in this room, I've got another 5 emails from community members about that.
But hopefully you're setting the agenda too, right? So hopefully you are.
I like to think so.
Because there is a lot of, just like, I mean, it's a really nice parallel of business, right? Any business leader, any company could define their interests very narrowly or very broadly. They could say, now we're focused exclusively on racial equity. That happened for a lot of businesses for a long time. And now we're focused on something else. There's a lot of flexibility in how you define your interests. And for a Jewish organization like that, it's interesting to see how that changes over time as you have more engagement from the community and from different segments of it.
Let me ask you, you talked about texting relationships in the context of looking at these relationships and perceptions. Do you have a definition of who actually has power in a local community?
No, I mean, because it does vary by community. In some places in the United States, it's still truly the case that, a business leader kind of has the most power. There's company towns that are kind of out there where one company has, the most of the employees of a community. In other places, there's a strong mayor. In some places, there's a very weak mayor. So it's going to vary. And also in some places, the state is kind of really removed from city interests. And in some places, the city and state are aligned in interest. So that stuff all varies quite a bit. And I guess it also is going to vary issue by issue. So I could think of like 5 different issues that I could think of as, these are central to the Jewish community's interest in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And for each one of those issues, where the power sits is gonna vary.
Mm-hmm. But part of the reason I asked this, in the world of organizing, which is the world I come out of, we do this thing called power analysis or power mapping.
Yeah.
And we try to figure out who actually you need as an ally, who can move the agenda, who can block an agenda. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is people assign a lot of power to certain people. Oh, the governor has absolute power of veto on X.
Right.
They will also assign a lot of power to some community. And you see like Boston Magazine sometimes does these things, others who are the top 100 influencers, say, in the city.
Yeah.
And it'll say somebody's like one of the top 10 influencers. And yet this is a person who, for a variety of reasons, whether it's their institutional interests, wouldn't necessarily engage on anything other than their thing. So you might have someone, not to pick a name on a person individually, you might have someone who's like a leader of one of the major hospital systems, mm-hmm. And is seen as one of the most powerful people in town because of that role. But it's also known that whether it's because of the culture of that hospital system or their particular focus, they're not going to speak out, say, about transportation issues or housing costs in Massachusetts, which are big public topics. So there's an element of who has the actual influence, but also to the extent that some people have more influence on issues than others because they don't engage those issues.
Right.
And there are like a lot of folks who have a lot of influence and aren't necessarily acting on, say, issues of concern to the Jewish community. And then there are a lot of things that we don't act on that maybe if we acted on, we might have more influence than we do.
Right.
We have no agenda when it comes to, say, public transportation in Greater Boston, which is clearly having an impact on large numbers of the community in many different ways.
Right.
And I just wonder about those dynamics of what it means to have influence and to use influence, and how to be transparent and open with the community about what the things are that one uses one's influence for.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, so to think about that hospital leader example, something like transportation is really interesting because the hospitals are some of the biggest employers in the state, and they are one of the few employers that are having, for example, like 24/7 staff, right, who rely on.
Right. In theory, they have an interest in being able to get to the jobs at 2 a.m.
Totally. They really do. They really do. They have nurses and techs and doctors who are using that public transportation. So they could conceive of transportation as a core interest to their business. With the Jewish community, I think it's sometimes there's just widespread disagreement about what's a core issue. Right. And so, let me just to be provocative, let me just give like an incredibly unpopular view. Okay. So I have 3 children mm-hmm. in Jewish day school. Mm-hmm. It's extremely expensive. It's like every dollar I make is going right to there. And it's a really core priority for my family. Now I see the innovations happening in now a dozen states of having universal school choice, of having, let's figure out a way to get as many public dollars as we can so that people who are choosing religious schools can go to them. And, Jewish communities in places that are happening, like Florida, are thriving.
Yeah.
We should do that. Now I say that's unpopular because I take the Boston Jewish community to be A, liberal in their political orientation on average, and B, not invested enough in my humble personal view, not invested enough in formal Jewish education. And so what I could see as like the core issue for a JCRC at a personal level. I know this is not the core issue for JCRC, but I could see this as the core issue. Like affordability across the board, it is one of, if not the core issues of the Jewish community. It is extremely expensive to lead a Jewish life.
Yes.
The communities where Jewish life thrives in Boston are unaffordable to most people. And the Jewish community is losing people every year that goes by, that people are boxed out of organized Jewish life. And things like day school affordability, things like housing, to me are like really aligned with what I see as like a Jewish agenda at the state. Now, the problem is that not everyone agrees with me. Meanwhile, there might be whole other issues where people are thinking, no, this, they might, there's a common view, as you probably know, of like social justice as the core orientation of the Jewish people. And so everything we do should be aligned for a particular conception of progressive social justice. And, that might not align. So then what's JCRC to do?
I think there's an element of what are the core priorities of the community and what are census priorities of the community. And one of the challenges for JCRC is that we approach this work from the perspective of what are consensus priorities.
Right.
And so to use the example of day school affordability, or I should say, the role of government in non-public schools.
Yeah, public dollars.
Right. There's a lack of consensus if you look at the totality of our community on that. I personally have opinions on it. As we've discussed on a previous podcast, my personal opinions are not necessarily what drives the agenda of JCRC, and so I have to separate those. And I think we have to figure out, like, not just in the absence of a consensus, what are in our self-interest, but also what are opportunities to move something.
Yeah.
For example, a few years back, there was an element of an understanding where there are federal dollars that are designated to follow the child that were not, in fact, following the child in Massachusetts. And so I was actually a signatory to a complaint. That led to a whole bunch of investigation, a lawsuit, whatever, that was largely organized by the day schools and the Catholic schools to essentially require or bring Massachusetts into compliance that federal dollars that follow the child would in fact follow the child in Massachusetts,
right?
Which ending up in non-public schools.
Right.
That was a place where we could make a contribution to the affordability of non-public schools for some parents in a way that we could find consensus as JCRC, because those were like existing dollars. And by the way, not to interrupt you, and it's movable in the state. The thing that I just described is a pipe dream. If something is seen as a dead horse at the State House, why expend political capital trying to move it? On the other hand, if something is moving at the State House, whether it's an economic development bill or a healthcare bill, and I don't just say this for us, we see lots of advocates who say, where are the opportunities to put things in there that advance particular agendas or particular needs of particular communities? Because this is actually moving. Right. And I do think part of being in the role of both holding a community and holding inside access and relationship is understanding in any given moment, whether that's a session or a political cycle, what's movable and what's possible and what's just like, this is not a place to spend capital, even if people in the community are saying we would benefit so much if that happened. We've been talking just now about two kinds of tensions. One is consensus in, say, the Jewish community about what the priorities are, and intention like what is possible in the next legislative session versus what our priorities are. What I think is really important about organizations like JCRC, but we could also go back to our earlier example about business leaders. It's very important in politics for there to be organizations that always have both the long term and the short term. And politicians and voters only have the short term.
this is what's like, this is so interesting to think about politics this way, that politicians basically think in 2-year cycles.
Yep.
And voters think at max in 2-year cycles. And there are some things like these just big, complex, hairy projects. When we think about the local level, we think about, the big dig or cleaning up the harbor or something like this. It's just like these nasty projects that take forever. And they do really need some poor long-term interests that are going to see a 10 or 20-year plan to fruition to be having their eye on that ball at the same time, which is not in any way a criticism of figuring out what you can get in the next legislative session. But I think one of the most delightful things about political advocacy is imagining how to get to that 10-year future, right? So the problem for the Jewish community of affordability in Massachusetts is not going away, and in the short term. And so the way I think about that is like, it could just be that we're willing to say, well, this is sort of like a legacy Jewish community, and younger Jews who care about the Jewish community, enjoy your life in Boca Raton or, somewhere else. Like, it's just not going to be here. It's going to be forever unaffordable. The housing's unaffordable. The school. And we said, so that could be the long-term plan for the Jewish community. It's not the one I want to see, because I care about this community. And so then what is the 10-year plan? What's the 20-year plan? And I think one of the great assets of JCRC is that it can convene the people who can think about that 10 and 20-year plan, in addition to doing the hard work day to day of advocating for interests. And what ends up being the deciding factor is people who care enough to weigh in. I don't know when it was, maybe 10 years ago, I was reading an article about one of the first Pew studies of the Jewish community. And there was a finding in that study that the community was fairly progressive in their attitudes about Israel. And a reporter asked Abraham Foxman, at the time the head of the ADL, what he thought about the fact that the community writ large was sort of to the left of what the ADL was advocating for. And Foxman has what I still think is just this memorable, amazing quote, which is, and at the time I really detested it. So let me tell you the quote. The quote is, I don't represent the Jewish community. I represent the Jewish community who cares. I'm paraphrasing, but it's something just like that.
I remember that.
And at the time I thought that was, I don't know, I think I was probably in college or grad school or something like that. And I thought, gosh, is that true? So then I because I'm a social scientist, I downloaded the Pew data, and I started defining Jews who care in different ways. Is it people who are members of synagogues? Is it people who light Shabbat candles? Is it people who donate money to their local federation? And basically any way you define Jews who care in the Pew data, Foxman was just spot on, that he does represent the people who care. And it's just that we think about the Jewish community that is everyone who identifies as Jewish, that that community is not the same as this much smaller group of people who somehow show that they care, either in their personal lives or in their communal lives. And so now I think I've come to appreciate the Foxman's position, which is like, that is his job. And in some ways, that was his job. And
right.
We could define it that way.
I mean, there's a lot of truth in that. And he may have said it in a very stark way, but there is an element of those who opt in have a voice. It goes to your comment about sort of teachers unions and local elections.
Right.
The folks who opt in and actually show up at the elections have an exponentially larger influence in the outcomes of those. Similarly, within the Jewish community, those who opt in, those who are showing up in synagogues and organizations on a week-to-week basis, the ones who come and ask the rabbi, what are we doing about or whatever? And then the rabbi calls the JCRC and says, what are we doing about whatever? Those are the ones whose voices carry more, not necessarily weight, but certainly more volume.
Right.
And then those who are opting out or not engaging. And so it's a constant tension of, do we speak for, and we actually grapple with this, we talk about this, do we speak on behalf of the organized Jewish community, i.e. the 40 organizations that have active members that participate, who send people to quarterly meetings to advise us on what our agenda ought to be? Or do we speak for the whole of the Jewish community as determined by, polling data about what American Jewish attitudes are? In the same way that people don't trust the courts, or they don't trust, the police, or they don't trust the military, they don't trust the government, whatever, all those they don't trust corporations, that lack of trust in institutions in the larger society is also taking place within the Jewish community. And so you have a more polarized community in which part of that polarization is a lack of trust in institutions. And that creates a deeper challenge for those of us who acting on behalf of, and I'm using that in quotations maybe, of the community, speaking on behalf of some organized version of it, and are in fact in a texting relationship with governors and mayors and senators to convey to them the concerns and mood of the community on any given day. And that's a real tension I'm sitting with, and you've definitely surfaced a lot of that.
But can I give you a glass half full rejoinder to that, which is that
I didn't know that was a glass half empty, but sure.
No, I mean the polarization part, right? Which is that I think I understood you to say that that's kind of a problem. And I
definitely think polarization is a problem.
Well, what I would just say is that I actually think the last couple of years have been a moment of Jews moving to the center in the sense that, here in Boston, but across the board, Jewish community has been quite progressive. And, the college campus version of this that I see is that you had a lot of students who were identifying as progressive who last year learned that progressive meant Hamas curious. And they've had a moment of figuring out, well, who are they? And I think that you see many of them gravitating away from sort of like left-wing protest movements toward institutional politics, toward the center. As a teacher, I see students grappling with that. And I see that there is a sort of an opportunity for organizations that are invested in this, to leverage that. That is like, these are students who are sort of reacquainting themselves with politics for the first time as adults. And they're thinking about power and allyship and all sorts of things in new ways. And it'll be interesting to see where they go from there.
Well, that takes us back to the 10 and the 20-year horizon on this, because I tend to think that the 10 and 20 year is not so much about what is the issue trying to move around, say, affordability of day schools, although that's a very important issue, the affordability of Jewish life, and more about what is our vision for how the American Jewish community is a cohesive and coherent entity and thriving in 20 years, which that is a piece of, but I think there are broader aspects to it, including the continued nature of America as an exceptional environment for Jews to live in, which has broader dynamics to it.
I do get the unfortunate sense that there are not that many of us in the university world who are really, truly invested in making sure students are getting a really full picture of American public policy, understanding why people might disagree with the students, or for that matter, the faculty on many issues. And I think it's just an incredible opportunity when you are doing it to teach students about the full range of issues, controversial issues they care about. Students are really interested in learning about conservatism. Why? Because they've never been able to think about, for the most part, why people on issues like gender and sexuality, marriage, divorce, guns, affirmative action, so many issues, why people have come to different conclusions as they have. And it's so obvious, that's kind of our job in colleges and universities to do that. But it's just not done very much. And so I would say it's close to my biggest priority right now to try to figure out how to expand on these efforts and build into the curriculum at as many schools as we can this focus on viewpoint diversity. I think we have a good model for doing it. And I think it's easy to see, if you think about it for a second, how it's aligned with interests of the Jewish community in terms of the culture on campus. I think we saw on many campuses across the country, a culture that was really not welcoming to Jewish students last year. Jewish students, faculty, I think, felt kind of burned by what happened on campus. And my strong belief is that in order for those cultural issues to be resolved, the campuses in general need to be much better at dealing with people who have a different opinion than they do. if you think about the Israel issue on campus, the main thing that's going on is that the Jewish students think something that most students disagree with. And campuses have created bubbles where they expect everyone to have roughly the same views on major issues of controversy, on reproductive rights and abortion, on gay rights. And so students have grown unaccustomed to just being in a room, a classroom, a dorm room with people who have really different policy positions. And when that happens, like it did with the surfacing of Israel and Zionism, students don't know how to deal with it. And so the way for them to deal with it is just to learn that, oh, actually, all of these issues are pretty complicated. There's a lot of gray area. People who are reasonable reach different conclusions than they do about core moral issues. And if you understand what their moral values are, what their religious values are, where they're coming from, you can really understand why people have reached different conclusions about every issue. They're not monsters. They just have a different core set of values. And I think that we need to embrace that on the campus, not just for that reason, but for a whole host of reasons. And I think we can do it. So I'm right now sort of like looking for partners and anyone else who has energy around campus ideological diversity issues.
I have been involved over the last year in this initiative around viewpoint diversity in the Jewish community. And I think a lot of things you're describing on campus are also true more broadly in the Jewish community and in society. The assumption that everyone in a space broadly will hold a certain range of views that are narrower than the reality of our society.
Right.
Whether you walk into a particular synagogue might be known as a more conservative synagogue or a more liberal synagogue. A particular Jewish institution has assumed that the board broadly agrees on X and Y well beyond the continued thriving of the Jewish people is something that the entire board ought to agree on as a priority. And I think we have a lot of work to do as a community in this idea of holding diverse viewpoints, which in organizations like ours can sometimes be confused with the idea that there ought to be viewpoint diversity at the table versus, and we will still take positions or postures that represent a consensus. And there is this tension of what does it mean for us of being an institution that takes stances on issues while also holding the diversity of viewpoints in the group, including those who have a different perspective on that stance.
Right.
And I also think that there's some element of challenge here because there is, in fact, part of this dynamic in this post-October 7th world of people who genuinely see the other as inhuman.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to say we have a fundamental disagreement, say, on the project of Jewish peoplehood. It's another thing to say you are you are committing genocide.
Right.
And I think that has to be navigated as well. Not just on campus, but off campus.
I for sure think
to be an expert on the campus dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, it's probably not that different, except that on campus the students have to live and be with each other all right. But look, just coming back to another important detail from all those Pew studies from previous years. I think one of the shocking findings that has come out that we have not processed as a community enough is that people who remember this report will remember this statistic, which is a huge percent of, say, Reform Jews think they have nothing in common with Orthodox Jews, or a huge percent of Orthodox Jews think they have more in common with religious Christians than with Reform Jews. Those were all pre-October 7th numbers, obviously. And I do think it's really important for JCRC and any Jewish organization that's trying to be an umbrella organization and a community to get all those people to understand each other better. So I think there's a lot of work to do about that.
Well, with a lot of work to do and a lot more that we could talk, we're going to have to have you back again to continue to have that conversation and others, and to continue to explore ways that we can and must expand viewpoint diversity in the community in order to be successful on that point. But for now, I just want to thank you, Dr. Hersh, Eitan, for being with us and for talking about some of these issues and for continuing to be both a thought partner and a thought practitioner in this community.
My pleasure. And thank you for your service in leadership in the community.
Thank you.